Hey everyone, Matthew LaCroix here with Paul Wallis to discuss the scouting research trip as part of the larger expedition that we're going to Lake Van, Turkey in only 9 days from today. And so this video will be giving lots of updates for what's going on because there's quite a few changes that have happened and evolved over, say, the last few months. As well as some of the excitement of what we're going to see and what we're about to do and some of the content we're about to capture. But to start, Paul, I just want to say, how are you, my friend? It's good to see you again.
G'day, Matt. It's great to be with you today. Getting excited. Only 9 days to go before we make our trip. So I'm making all the final preparations, making sure I've got the right clothes, the right footwear, and bringing the right notes with me. And it's been a while since I've been in this part of the world, the part that we're traveling to in Turkey. And I'm just looking forward to being back in that country again. But it will be a first going to these particular sites. So my juices are flowing.
I remember, I think it was maybe early September. It was at some point, I think it was September that you and I did that first show on the Fifth Kind about introducing Ayanis and talking about these sites. We did like a big 2.5 hour show, and I introduced like the Kef box relief to you, and you were like staring at it like, wow, we were having those amazing conversations. Think about how much has happened from that all the way to now. And here we are 9 days away from leaving to go there, to go to these sacred sites that have completely been missed under the radar for various reasons by the
Oh, that's
archaeological
right.
community. And we're going to try to explore this mystery in a way where we want to be open-minded, objective, but also scientific. Let's take all of what we know, explore these mysteries, and see what seems to be very clear and obvious to many is that these sites, the original base sites for many of these temples, including Ayanis and Shavus Tepe, that have a much older history at their base, and there's younger designs built around it. And that has created great confusion over the course of many hundreds, if not even potentially thousands of years, with what civilization built what, who is who, and then what exactly this timeline is, right, Paul?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, anyone who's read my new book, The Invasion of Eden, will know how that conversation really gripped me when we were looking at that basalt box, which, as you rightly say, I mean, it's been in a museum for more than 50 years, and yet it's like a time capsule from another time. And the question of what time, which culture, which civilization we are looking at information from has absolutely fascinated me. And in the Invasion of Eden, I talk about that walk that we took in Boulder, where you were sharing your thoughts about the sites that we're going to be visiting and the impact of them, the significance of them. And that really sent me down a couple of rabbit holes, and they relate to the things you've already mentioned. So, first of all, I'm really looking forward to seeing the language that is there, the language of symbology that's been carved into artifacts at all the sites that we're going to be visiting,
Yeah.
and asking where has that language come from? How developed was it? How does it fit in the history of symbology and language around the world? And what is the information that it has to offer us? Because this is an incredible privilege to have pristine information from so long ago, wanting to tell us things about history, ourselves, our place in the cosmos, our nature as humanity. Who knows what the secrets might be that are being carried? But it's been carried, and I say pristine, because so much of it was carved in such a way that we know exactly the shape of things we're looking at. It's a matter of what's the message that's being carried. And you mentioned timelines. We talked about Shurupak and how that site was dated, and the question of here's one level of city, here's another. What's the connection between them? What's the distance in time between them? Is it the same culture that's produced both, or was there a prior culture? And so there are all these questions and layers of mystery around the places where we're going. And in the research path that led me to writing The Invasion of Eden, I have become very interested in this particular part of the world, in what today is Turkey, because there are so many vectors pointing to that part of the world as being very significant to the human story. I mean, many people will know the Noah story, the
Yes.
story of the repopulation of the planet from Ararat, out of the Ararat culture. But that's not the only vector pointing that way. You can study ancient languages and you'll find yourself going to that part of the world. You can study materials science. You'll be going to that part of the world because that's where the Iron Age began. That's where building with stone began. Um, all kinds of firsts pop up in that part of the world that make the sites we're looking at really very, very auspicious places indeed. So that's just a few of the reasons why I'm excited about
Yeah.
getting into this research with you, because I love your passion for this and how meticulous a researcher you are. I think we're going to have a lot of fun researching together in these places.
Thank you, Paul. That was very well said. We're gonna dig into a lot of those points. That was really, really good. It's like a summary of like this whole overview of what we're looking at right now. The first thing I want to say, Paul, is very much congratulations on the incredible new book release you have. You have what a series you've laid out with the Eden series, and I feel quite an honor to be in the new book and having that conversation that we had walking around a nice high elevation Rocky Mountain lake together and having some fantastic conversations that day. And so if anyone hasn't checked that out, make sure you get all of Paul's books. They're just phenomenal, and he's a great writer and he's a great mind. So, and on top of that, I want to say one more thing. Yesterday was Paul's birthday, so happy birthday, Paul. This is a very special thing to have you on this expedition and this research scouting trip. And before we dig into the topics you mentioned, I wanted to take this opportunity to clarify what exactly is happening now for this trip and for trips coming up in the future, because a lot's changed. A lot has shifted as we've evolved with our understanding of these sites. So before we dig into some of them and some of the questions that Paul had, I want to give some updates, general updates for everyone. The first one that, of course, Paul is a part of, which is why he's sitting here right now, is that we are going to be leaving in 9 days. 9 days. Paul leaves from Australia and meets me, and I leave from California, and we meet up in Van, Turkey, and we will be there for about 9 days. Now that trip is going to be it's going to be the 8th through the 17th. Paul's going to get in a little earlier than I am. And that is going to be a very important trip while we're here because it is the scouting and research portion. Now, for clarity purposes, this is not when the general documentary is going to be filmed and not when most of the experts join us. Paul is joining this as part of the research scouting trip, and I appreciate Paul's diligence on looking at these sites and being able to explore them from a symbolic and a megalithic and an ancient perspective. And so we'll be joining forces to go into these in a completely organic way. Some of them require hiking. We won't do any diving, Paul, because you and I need to get a little more experience before we dive under the depths of Lake Fawn. But that'll come in the
Sure.
future, not for us, but for some more experienced people. But we will be going to, of course, Ayanis, as well as some of these other proxy temple sites, which require hiking and exploring. And many of them, which is very unusual anywhere in the world outside of perhaps Syria or Iraq, have very little to no infrastructure and gives us the opportunity to explore them. And not only that, but temples such as like the Kef Temple, which is known as Kef Kalesi. And for those who don't know, the word Kalesi means fortress, which is why I don't say it. But Kef Temple, as well as Shavuz Tepe, are what we call only partially excavated. Partially excavated meaning there's a lot left still to find. There's a lot left remaining, and there are things that we will be capturing. I won't say specifically what they are yet, but Paul and I are going to be going to places that are not tourist locations. These are not places where people are snapping tons of photographs and you have fences with, people walking around telling you about the area. These sites are not like that. These sites have little to no infrastructure. Some of them are on top of mountains. Like I said, one of them we have to actually hike up into, and we will be exploring places that have a rare opportunity, we're going to call it, a rare opportunity to not dig or uncover, because we can't do that and we won't do that, but we can capture and photograph things that we find and things that we see. And when you have a situation such as, let me give an example, a place like Kef Temple up on top of a mountain, when you find out that the Kef box relief was found strategically southeast towards the town of Adel Savez, and the fact that we look at the locations of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, and we look at things like these major events like the Younger Dryas and others, we have to try to imagine what could have destroyed these sites. And in understanding what could have destroyed them, it gives us an understanding of where things might be. And the reason I say that is that Kef Temple is sitting on top of a mountaintop, and on its slopes reside what is many untold and undiscovered things still. In the future, sites like Kef Temple will be something that I hope that other archaeologists and scientists can come together and help do things like ground penetrating radar and find these other temples and other artifacts that were never fully found, because this is the origins of what I believe is the origins of everything. The origins of this ancient Sumerian lineage and this pre-Armenian, pre-Urartian origin point of these mythos and legends that seem to go back to the very beginning of time. And which is why I believe that sites like Ayanis and Kef are the oldest temples on Earth. And that's something that we're going to explore, that mystery of how old are they? How far back does their story go? How does it connect to the Urartian civilization? How does it differ from the Urartian civilization? Those are all important things and questions that we must ask in order to understand the different timelines and the different places in our chronological understanding of history for when this grand civilization emerged and what its influences were on the surrounding region, Paul.
Yes, that's exactly right. One of the really interesting things about this region is the possibility of dating sites and artifacts because of the level of Lake Van. That's really what gives us the ability to inquire into the timelines of these places and work out just how old these sites are. How do these relate to the wider story of the emergence of civilization, which we associate with the miracle of Sumer, the emergence of ancient Sumeria? And
Yeah.
so I'm looking forward to that. I think it's exciting. I think we're very lucky to be able to go and do this kind of research because there's been plenty found over the last half century plus that is really awaiting a lot of research. There are so many artifacts, and there are not always researchers who are free to go to these places and probe the questions thrown up by these artifacts. And I think we're really lucky that we're able to do this. And we will film everything we're allowed to film. We'll be very respectful because there are places that are considered so special and so sacred that you can't film them.
Yes.
But we will
Yes.
have the privilege of seeing them for ourselves and thinking about what we're seeing, and we'll film everything that we're allowed to film. And I think that gives us plenty to think about in terms of the questions that really excite us. How does this relate to the wider story of civilization, the wider story of humanity? And there is, in French, there's this phrase, an embarrassment of data. That means an overwhelming amount of data waiting to be sifted through and analyzed and thought about. And as I
Right.
said before, I think that the language of the sites is going to really interest me. My background is 33 years in church-based ministry, and I was for some of that time at the high end, the Anglo-Catholic end of the Anglican Church, where sacred spaces are very important and architecture is very important and symbology is very important. Artifacts are important, and all those things are part of the language of the sites that we're going to be going to. So I'm going to be looking at these sites and getting my head around how these spaces are structured and therefore how they may have been used, and therefore what the significance is of objects that are still in situ. But then I love how you've raised the point, Matt, that not everything is where it started out. And so, you know, the Halder's basalt box is not where it started out. And so we can do a little bit of detective work to work out, well, how have things moved? What caused
Yeah.
those movements? What does that have to say to our dating of these sites and therefore the significance of them? And those things are all connected. And I mean, for instance, well, let me put it this way. If we find an object that belongs to a pivotal moment in the human story, that puts a different degree of importance on the information that those people wanted to bequeath to the future at that point.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a temple that someone's built that they expect to last forever, well, that might have different information in it, a different spirit. In one place, you might find artifacts of commemoration, but in another place, you've got very deliberate, intentional communication to future cultures and future generations. And that's really what caught my attention when we had that first conversation about Haldy's box, because that's how I understood that artifact.
Yeah, it's certainly that mystery just gets deeper and deeper the more you look into it. And I wanted to bring up just a couple more dates and some more information as we're discussing this. The first thing is that the full documentary, the full expedition with all of the archaeologists, which we're still looking to finalize an archaeologist right now, if anyone's listening to that, or even archaeologist or two, as well as we have a geologist, but that is looking to launch September 1st. That might have a little bit of wiggle room and move around slightly, but right now that's the forecasted date for the full expedition to Lake Von and for another area of Turkey that I won't bring up yet, but we can tease and talk about it a little bit. And if you haven't seen it, I just released the new launch trailer for the Ayanis expedition that shows a lot of footage from Penn Museum, and as well as hinting at what we're about to do and what we're about to find. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. And of course, Paul is part of that whole entire trip. And his expertise is going to be incredibly important for this, especially from his understanding of ancient religious backgrounds into symbology and how these objects and these enigmatic symbols left behind, how they play into not only the ancient past, but how they play into modern religion and our
Oh,
understanding of these
yes.
symbols today. It's you can call that truly a rabbit hole where you keep looking and it goes deeper and deeper into an area you never imagined until you get to places like the Knights Templar and the Vatican and other places where you say, I
Exactly.
could never imagined where these things would have led. Even another symbol that I'm exploring very detailedly right now, which actually comes from the Kef box relief, is what I believe is the origin of the fleur-de-lis symbol. So this
Yes.
whole thing just keeps going deeper and deeper
Yeah.
as we get into these mysteries. And as I want to mention, and Paul, of course, will be part of these videos, but he has his own YouTube channel, and I hope everyone supports him as well as the Fifth Kind. But we will be having, or I will at least be having, daily videos going over introducing, where we're going to be going each day, showing some snippets of walking around and exploring these sites with Paul and some other people that are going, as well as maybe like a little summary at the end each day. And so each one of these this scouting research trip, each one of these days, we'll be going to unique sites such as Ayanis, and we're going to be exploring each one of these sites. And we're also going to be going, I can mention, we're going to be exploring some mysterious islands in Lake Von with some old Armenian churches, and even get up into the Armenian highlands with Mount Ararat, which of course anyone that knows following this work that I do, I very much could only find one name that really would fit this mysterious civilization because of their holy interest in Mount Ararat, which is why, of course, that is the name that I'm currently using, which is the Ararat civilization, because they didn't leave a name. Just like the ancient Egyptians never left a name on any of their structures at all. We only know of the name Kemet or the land of Kemet from some other various sources. But those civilizations were mysterious because they didn't actually really call themselves anything. I mean, we think of something like the Tiwanaku civilization of Bolivia, but we don't even know if the original builders were the Tiwanaku people or an earlier culture, just like the Inca. The Inca, what we think of as a classical Inca, is really just a lineage of a much later time when there may have been some family ancestral bloodline connections back to the original with some of the rulers, but we don't really know how far exactly that gap was. I speculate that we're at least talking about the end of the Younger Dryas at about 11,600 years ago. But how long was that gap in between that to when the Incan civilization emerged out of the Amazon and then found the ruins? We don't know how long that gap is still today. That is actually, believe it or not, is a more mysterious time period of Earth human history, in my opinion. I've spent a lot of time studying timelines, as Paul knows. I find that to be a more mysterious time than at some points even older than the Younger Dryas, because there's more data. There's more civilizations that seem to leave things behind. What you actually find is that after the Younger Dryas, there seems to be a rebuilding attempt in some places, but then this big gap, this gap in this because I say gap, I mean gap in knowledge. And
Yes.
the reason I say that is because the technology available with building and utilizing stone just completely just vanished. The Inca, for example, is a great example, as well as the Urartians, seem to have no concept of how to do anything with megalithic stone. I mean, bar none. That's a great point we can bring up right now is go look at the Inca, a place like Machu Picchu or Ollantaytambo or Sacsayhuaman, and you see this brick and mortar small cobblestones. A lot of them have not even been fully shaped. They're kind of put together in somewhat of a cohesive way, but they're not finely dressed at all. Go across the world to where we are talking about right now, which is like Vaughn, and the Urartian civilization only left behind either brick and mortar or a sedimentary limestone block. Now, the thing I want to bring up here, Paul, is that a place like Chavus Tepe, we find two very, very distinctive buildings. Actually, I could even say maybe three at that site with the basalt, the beautiful, beautiful dressed basalt with the original cuneiform in it, which if people don't know, it's called Heikeberg, which the text there speaks about Haldi and King Haik being the original or the origins of the Armenian civilization being part of those builders. It does not mention Rusa II, just so you know. It's very interesting actually to read the different translations that have been done and how the lens of the where they're looking at the civilization for seems to be determining, in my opinion, this isn't the opinion necessarily shared by others, but the lens they seem to be looking at translating this seems to be from the lens of the Urartians, which I think is causing great confusion, not only in ancient symbols, but in understanding what specific phrases mean. Because there's a very, very big difference between calling something a fortress and calling something a temple. It's actually much greater than a lot of people may at first understand. You're basically determining what the purpose of that place was by giving it a name. It's a very
Yes.
powerful thing to do. And then all of a sudden, if you give it the name Kalesi, like, Kef Kalesi or these other sites, you get this automatic understanding. It's a fortress. Everything must be looked at through the lens of an empire, a war empire that's like more of a conquering empire, which the Urartians were. They ended up going down, it looks like, in conquering at some points parts of Upper Mesopotamia and getting into even skirmishes with Bel in Babylon. So there's a whole history behind these regions and how they've been directly influenced. But Paul, what are your thoughts on the fact that these sites and what has been left behind may be something where it hasn't been as organized or as shown in a way that we can comprehensively see it, like other places in the world? Like, for instance, look at a place like Machu Picchu or like Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, where you have very, very excellent excavations that have been done, roped off, fenced off at different points. You can see where they've excavated. It's very clear. Everything has been pretty carefully looked at. And then you look at a place like Tef Temple, sitting on top of the mountaintop with scattered ruins of megalithic stones strewn all over the place. It almost looks like nobody's ever even been there, like any archaeologist has been there. And it really brings up this sadness in me, Paul, because number one, how many of these artifacts and different things have been taken by people hiking through, walking through, seeing things, ending up in like in an antique shop somewhere in different things? Because I've found out through a connection I have in Turkey, Paul, that there is an entire industry of artifacts that are being bought back and brought back to museums because they're
Yeah.
ending up in antique stores. So one of the things I want to mention is, and as you just asked that question, is I think we need to pop into Adel Cevez to a couple antique shops and see if there's anything we can rescue while we're there.
That's a that's a very good point. Uh, Having said that, of course, we really want to honor these sites
Yes.
because we feel these really do deserve to have fencing around them and be treated with great respect because of the antiquity of them, because of the information they carry, because of the research that still has to be done into these places. And one of the interesting questions that's thrown up by what you were talking about earlier, Matt, where you've got this megalithic these megalithic structures using very precise engineering of very large blocks. And you're thinking, wow, what do we not know about the culture that produced that? And then you come to the more recent layer, and oh, now they're building in what looks like a more primitive fashion and with smaller blocks. And then up here, oh, it looks like they stopped building with stone altogether. You can find that pattern all around the world. And people might look at that and say, what happened to that culture? What happened to that civilization? Did it vanish? Are we looking at simply a story of a timeline and a succession of cultures? Or are we looking at the record of migrations that the people who built this way in this place, and then they moved off somewhere else and built that way in another place? Is that what we're looking at? A more global picture and a picture that is illuminated when we sort of fan out from that area and look further across the region and further around the world. If you think about what happened in ancient Rome, for instance, I mean, ancient Rome was a magnificent place of phenomenal buildings, campuses, vistas. And then you've got people building with brick, small stone, with wood. What happened? Well, what happened, of course, is Rome moved. Rome moved a long way away, and then the people who were there started to effectively loot their own heritage to build their own farmhouses and their own pattern of life. And the whole lifestyle of the region had shifted, and hence we see that succession of building that looks like a degradation. And I think you can see evidences of that in Central and South America as well, as cultures migrated across that continent and took their technologies with them. So I'm going to be very interested to look at that, because I said earlier about vectors pointing to Turkey and to these ancient lands, and some of those stories have to do with migrations. So I argue in The Invasion of Eden that Abraham and all the migrations associated with him began in that part of the world. If you listen to Snorri Sturluson writing in the 1200s, he talks about the Aesir who came and annexed Northern Europe. He talks about them coming from that part of the world. So it's another migration story of an advanced culture. And so these are some of the things I'm going to be looking for as we go to these sites and get a sense of not only a moment in time, but what's the movement of people and the movement of cultures that's represented here. And then another thing I want to pick up on what you said, Matt, is you talked about we'll go to these places and we'll see some symbology that will be familiar to people who study Knights Templar, people who are aware of the symbology around the Vatican. And what intrigues me about that is I know that we will find emblems, artifacts, symbols that I could pick up and say, oh, yes, this is a Christian symbol. I know what this means. But then what if I were to tell you that this language predates the Ice Age? It suddenly doesn't mean what I thought it meant. And I now have to consider, well, how did it come to mean what I think it means? Is that a reinterpretation of an ancient language, or is there a continuity? What was the information this symbol originally carried? Does it connect with what I thought I knew, or does it enrich it, or does it completely overturn it?
Yeah.
And I mean, people from many cultures could go to these sites and say, oh, I recognize some of this language, but why is that? And what did it mean then? And then how do we reinterpret what we thought we knew about the language we've been using?
Right. No, that's a great point to bring up, specifically around. I mean, we don't say just Ayanis. I mean, the Kef box relief has many of these origin symbols that seem to be deeply tied to monotheistic religions, especially the Holy Roman Empire and others. This origin point where we see these symbols being almost fought over. We see the Knights
Oh,
Templar
yes.
having some secret society where they're defending something, and we see the same cross used even today in the Vatican, but yet that's not the cross that Christianity uses. So it's very interesting how,
Ah, well, yes, it does in parts.
right, right.
And which parts is
Right,
very
right.
interesting.
And there's a
Yeah.
distinguishing aspect there to explore. Why do we have a different kind of cross talking about the story with Jesus and this different concept during Pisces, but yet what potentially is a much, much older cross, one that maybe predates all of those by thousands of years, that the original Knights Templar in the Vatican are still using in its exact form today. That
Yes.
cross, either known as the Knights Templar cross or the Red Cross, is a very enigmatic and mysterious cross that forms what looks like a circle on each end. The way that each end of the cross forms, it forms more of a circle, and it's even on all sides. What's fascinating is that cross is only present at Ayanis. It's not present in any other of these locations that I know have direct connections, because it's the same stonework, same pillar designs at the entrances. All of these things are there, but yet the stones have no symbols carved into them. And I wanted to bring this up because it's a perfect opportunity to talk about this, is that what we're exploring around Lake Vaughan is now become much bigger. Now, I've mentioned, if people have listened to Paul and I or have seen updates, we are now including Peru as a direct connection from these symbols to Peru. And I won't mention what the site is right now, but and as well as direct connections from Turkey to Peru and then to Bolivia. And where the story seems to go but not end is to include even Egypt. And there are further connections using the symbology and using this movement of ideas and ancient knowledge, is we see connections as well as that I have not really unveiled yet, but we will in future trips with India, with Cambodia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Petra, Jordan. And I can mention others such as like ancient Greece outside of Athens, as well as Menorca, Spain, and all these other places, even Göbekli Tepe. We have what seems to be some kind of an origin point here that travels around the world. But I mentioned that, Paul, because the scope of this was previously based on an understanding of saying, well, these symbols match these symbols around the world. They must have become maritime, or they must have traveled there somehow. Like the stories of Viracocha in South America are very clear. The stories of Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl in Mexico and Central America are very, very clear. Knowing that some kind of a traveler, some kind of a wisdom sages were creating something along the way. But having only that, and having stones that match and symbols that match isn't enough. It's not quite enough. If you're going to be able to create this new proposed hypothesis about our lost civilizations and our human civilization, the uprising of it in a chronological order, we need to have more evidence. And that came with a very recent connection about a week and a half ago that I talked to Paul about. Now, I'm not going to give the name of the location right now. It'll be something that we will be unveiling as we go along. But I'll give some hints, is that this site is over 4 100 miles away, over over 400 miles away, 426 or 425 miles to be exact, as the crow flies. And the site has the exact same stonework, same pillars at the entrance, and same inner sanctum design as these Lake Fawn temples, especially like Ayanis. Why is that so important? Well, when you're trying to scope out and understand a civilization, you look at the area that it encompassed. You look at the central points that it was had these royal temples and citadels, and you can get understanding of how large a civilization was, what its capacities were, how culturally advanced they were. All of these things require a very large civilization to be able to have all those things at their disposal. You cannot have hunter-gatherers traveling around and creating incredible things. They wouldn't have the means, the time, or any of the resources to be able to do that. So we can just take that whole thing off the table. But we can't take off the table are these mysterious lost civilizations that seem to be moving around the world in different ways, where they're influencing and creating other civilizations, like in John Taylor's book. That's a very important book that discusses the lines of Shem and Ham and Japheth and where they went in different parts of the world. It's from the 1876. It was a book that really helped me a lot in this journey. Now, I want to mention, though, that this site is on what became the Silk Road, and which is fascinating and very, very important because it means that this site likely established the Silk Road. Now, if people don't know what the Silk Road is, it was one of the most important ancient trading routes from Asia to the Mediterranean, which then allowed every commodities and goods and information to seamlessly travel anywhere in the world. Once you get to the ocean, once you get to the Mediterranean, there's nothing that limits you other than being able to be good, sailors and understanding how to navigate the open seas. But this site, Paul, is so far away from Lake Vaughan, and it has the exact same similarities and the same work, that it tells us something. It tells us about movements. It tells us about movements and availability of this civilization. And even if we don't have necessarily other direct connections yet like this to the south and southeast, we now have one to the west, to the northwest. And this place in the future will be one of these keys that shows the movement all the way to the Mediterranean, all the way, in creating what became what I believe is a global civilization, a global golden age lost civilization that I think traveled around and created things like ancient Greece. And because I'll mention one more thing about this, because I don't have a good poker hand. But at this new site, the pillars, instead of being square, are circular, just like we see in ancient Greece and Rome, like an evolution is taking place over time. So I find the parallels and some of the connections extremely compelling and interesting here, Paul. And if you want, Paul, you can be on that trip to explore that site, because that's going to be one of the ones that we add to this now, because it keeps growing. It keeps growing, and we don't know how big it's going to get. We now have what you could call, I'll say, 5 sites, 5 primary sites, 4 primary temples, because we don't know the function of the underwater ruins under Lake Vaughan. We don't have enough information about them to know what exactly they were. But I can tell you that we now have 4 primary temples that show striking similarities that we're exploring right now. But it opens up the entire avenue, Paul, for where this civilization may have been migrating to and what its influences might have been around the world.
Yes. Oh, that is really exciting. Um, it was just as you were saying that it occurred to me to say that this is not just a story of human evolution and the development of cultures, and it's not just a story that touches on our religious thinking around the symbols that are there, but it's a story to do with power as well,
Yeah.
and the nature of empires and how our planet has been governed through the ages. Why is it that in Great Britain today, when the Windsor family wants to assert that it has authority to own a sixth of the planet's land masses and to govern the United Kingdom in the way it does, why does it reach for language which possibly predates the most recent ice age? Why does the USA, when it wants to assert its preeminence on the planet, use language that might possibly have been with us since before the last ice age? Is that just borrowing of language, borrowing of symbols, or is there more to it? And I say that knowing that there's more to it,
Hmm.
because I mean, for instance, recently we had the coronation of King Charles III, and there were objects used in that coronation that carry a meaning as objects, including um, um, portions of megalithic structures. I'll just say that much, where there's a very deliberate tying to previous cultures and previous story that takes us thousands of years into the past. Is this really just part of the romance or the sort of civic religion around the politics of power? Or is there more to it than that? And I think it relates to the big question of how much has actually been remembered. Because we've talked about the loss, the disappearance, the mystery, but how much of that knowledge has actually been remembered and carried by um, different traditions, royal traditions, esoteric traditions, because there's always a strange blend of what's been forgotten and what's been remembered, and working out how those things are split and what are the traditions that have carried the ancient knowledge. That's one of the white rabbits I want to follow as we go to these places. I mean, I think that that fifth site you mentioned is a pivotal one, really, because we don't want to look at these sites as in a bubble and have a conversation that's all about the past, when in fact there's a segue into the world you and I know.
Yes.
And then the questions become far more important and, dare I say, even more interesting, because it begins to shape our understanding of why things are the way they are today.
Yes. And
And
I
I
want to
think
bring
that
up
that's where it leads.
it's a great point, and that's a great segue into exactly talking about this big connection you just mentioned, this fifth site. One of the things that's fascinating to me when I was looking into it is that, and we know this in many parts of the world, but you're talking about this old connection, what was understood still, what was known still, what remained more in the more echelons of the Holy Roman Empire and the halls of these great, secret societies and these groups that, didn't share these things. Well, this new site, I found it fascinating that one of the best representations of the Byzantine eagle, or Byzantine eagle, as it's also said, is in this rock that is right at the site. There's this huge double. What Byzantine eagle is, an eagle that's looking both ways. It's looking both directions. It's about, total, and as like an empire, knowing all, owning all and knowing all. But that's fascinating because this site became one of the most important Holy Roman Empire sites that built right on top of it, which the Urartians had already built on top of as well. So what's going on here? What kind of connection and understanding is passing between, with thousands of years, sometimes gap, with these
Yeah.
cultures emerging and discovering this ancient ancestral lineage and finding these mysterious relics and then incorporating them into their civilization, then building on top of these sacred sites, potentially using them for some of the same ways, but maybe not. Maybe not.
Yes.
Maybe using
Yep.
them as just more of a castle or something where they incorporated them and then used them in a way where they're like protecting their ancient lineage in some proud way. But what I find really interesting is that not only did the Holy Roman Empire build there, but they left behind some sacred temples at the same place, in the same location. And the symbol, one of one of the things they built next to this what's left over of this ancient Ararat civilization site, not Urartian, but next to it, they built like a sanctum, a chapel type of design that's the same design that we see at the Vatican today. So the way, if you look at the Vatican from a helicopter view or from a plane above it, you see this shape that's like almost like an hourglass that comes down with this, and it's the same shape is present at this site as well. So that rabbit hole just keeps getting deeper and deeper, Paul, to really asking the questions of, what did they still know? Seeing the emergence of
Yes.
mysterious groups like the Knights Templar that have the exact same cross and are traveling around and protecting mysterious things and finding things like even the stories of the Ark of the Covenant that may even be connected in some way, even to things like Solomon. It gets deeper and deeper down into this story of how a lot of what we think of these ancient traditions, these ancient groups, and these empires seem to be built out of a knowledge and understanding of an ancient past, but not in a way of being primitive, in a way of being revered, where they understood something incredible had existed, and it became the focal point of a lot of their culture in a way where I think even kings and dynasties were being determined by potentially the connections that still were back to that age, as well as
Yes.
even sage and priests that had knowledge and connected to that. There was something passing between all of them. Now, what I find fascinating is that this new site was found in 1938 accidentally when they were digging a railroad, and it was excavated in 1951, and in those subsequent years of 1954, in the same years, Kef Temple was then found 400 miles away. Okay, these two pre-Urartian Ararat civilization sites, they end up being found, and Shavuos Tepe, all in the same time period, 1951 to 1954. They're excavated and discovered, all in the same time. What did they know? Something's going on there, Paul, because they find one and all of a sudden they find the next one's over 400 miles away. It's like they found something they were looking for. And then what
Yes.
happened? Nobody heard about them, and they sort of disappeared into the analogs of time, which is compelling to me and actually tells a lot. Because if you were to try to do something like that, what would your motivation be? What would your motivation be to leave something abandoned and sort of unknown, to move through and really not bring any attention to it? You would only do that if it was something very, very important. But not just something important, something that could radically shift our entire understanding of history, religion, all of these ancient connections. And you can imagine whoever that made those decisions to not have these fully excavated and have them abandoned. Literally, nobody had, from 1954, these almost disappeared from history until the 2000s, when people started talking about them a little bit, and I started talking about them and others. But think about that gap, an enormous amount of time where they were just left there, ignored. The Kef box relief was taken to the Vaughan Museum and left outside in the garden for 20 years to get rained on and to have flowers grow around it. I find that very telling. And I think it goes back to an understanding that they definitely understood at least deep aspects of what these things embodied, what they meant, what the symbols meant, what the lineages were. And we need to go in and explore that mystery, Paul, and see what we can find.
Definitely. Well, here is the value of the freelance researcher, because one layer of the answer to that question is where are the dollars that pay for archaeological research? Where do they come from? What do they want to pay for?
Right.
And it really often is down to freelance researchers to go to places that have just been left,
Yes.
where the telling of the story, is not being paid for whatever reason.
Yes.
And that's why I say we're so lucky to be going to these places where the story has not been told, where it's been off syllabus, where we've still been in an era of forgetting, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited to be part of the remembering of why were these places important and important for so long,
Yeah.
and yet they're so unimportant now in terms of the budgets of universities and institutions around the world, that they haven't even built a fence. So
Right.
I think, yes, I mean that
That's
is a
good. I like
question
that.
well worth probing.
Yes, and that brings to another great layer to talk about and connect here. Now, for those who've been following, seen some of my social media posts, some of the images I put up, as well as the new trailer, if you haven't seen it yet, back a couple months ago, the first part of the expedition was filmed and done. So part one, which it includes 5 countries total. So it's United States through Penn Museum, which is what I'm talking about now. And then we have Turkey, Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt, and then other future things. But the first part of the expedition was spending a whole day and going, and Paul unfortunately did not have a chance to be a part of that. But that was a trip that we took to explore both the archives of Penn Museum as well as the museum itself, which just so happens to have one of the largest Mesopotamian collections of artifacts arguably in the world. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the Penn stuff that's there is not always very well known. And it certainly wasn't super well known to me as well, even for someone who studied the cuneiform tablets, Sumerian, Akkadian, Syrian, and Babylonian. I found it rather compelling of what I saw there and what was in front of me that potentially wasn't labeled correctly or others. But I want to mention first, though, that what we did is we went to explore the connection that was a big part of this connection, Paul, that we've talked many, many times about, which led to a lot of this. And it's one of the pivotal keys to this whole story. And that is the 1931 Penn Museum excavations of Shuruppak, which was called Tel Farah in the modern day times at the top level. So if you went there today, the area you would see on a map is called Tel Farah. Now, Penn Museum it was a combination of an archaeological expedition that was done from a joint American and German archaeological teams that went to Iraq before really very few people had been there. The 1800s had excavations, but then there was a gap up until 1931, and then they started exploring again and excavating. And during that, going through sandstorms and all these incredible journeys, if you read about the papers, the archaeologists there made some stunning discoveries. And I won't go super deep into that because I've talked about it many times. You can watch previous videos I've done with Paul as well, where we go into great detail about that. But I will just summarize to say that what they found were 3 distinctive civilizations that had lived in that region. 3, not one. The top one was called Tel Farah, but that wasn't even included in the civilizations they discovered. The 3 they found were in increments as they excavated down. The first 2 civilizations were found within the first 20 feet of sediment, and they were somewhat primitive. They were called stratum 1, 2, and then 3 in a chronological order. Stratum 1 would be near the top. Stratum 2 would be in the middle, and then 3 would be at the very bottom. But what was remarkable was the difference not only between stratum 1 and 2 of these 2 civilizations, but the difference between stratum 3 was remarkable. Because not only was it stratum 3 highly advanced, highly sophisticated with pottery and cuneiform, especially comparing to stratum 1, but it was separated by a 17-foot inundation layer of sediment with no human remains, no evidence of any cultural infusion of living in between that time. And the only way you can get that, Paul, is if you get a massive event. An event that deposits an enormous amount of material, and you have a good amount of time that goes by with silt and dust that blows in and then fills in the rest. And what was remarkable about that was that this team had written a whole paper detailing all of what they found, and at the bottom, near the end, had a long conclusion. And in that conclusion, they talked about the striking comparisons to the mythos narrative, the mythos of Noah narrative, but not just that. The original Ziusudra story from the Atrahasis, Sumerian king list, Eridu Genesis, all of these. Keep Eridu Genesis in mind for a second. And in that, it's very detailed, describing that these last Sumerian kings, Ubaratutu was ruling over an ancient city of Shuruppak that predated pretty much everything we can think of in the ancient world. And it actually was talked about that extensively in the Epic of Gilgamesh, with that city being older than everything else around it, including Ur and Uruk. And in that, what you find is that what they're talking about with these ancient kings, the son of Ubaratutu being who we think of as Ziusudra, or Untapishtim, who became the Noah figure. What we find is that was this ancient lineage of Sumerian kings. And the story goes that Ubaratutu had ruled over Shuruppak for an enormous amount of time, hundreds of years. And when he passed on the rulership to his son, Ziusudra, his son briefly ruled over the city as a priest and a king. very briefly before a great disaster was incoming. And he was warned through a reed bed by his patron god Enki of this great disaster. And that's where you get the whole story of protecting his family and building this craft out of bitumen and cedar and bringing, his animals on board and his family and then surviving some event. Well, the comparisons to that were so striking by these archaeologists in 1931 that it led to this whole connection of, number one, that Shuruppak wasn't a myth, that they had found
Yes.
within 3 tablets, the name Shuruppak was discovered. All of a sudden, what was a myth, this Genesis myth of these ancient biblical places, like Nimrod, which I believe was the original connection to this, is that in Abraham, like Paul mentioned, we find that these archaeologists could not help but point out the comparisons to that and how the data
Yes.
really supported that
Yeah.
that possibly could have been a real event. And so what did we do? We packed up and we rented out the Penn Museum for a whole day and the archive, and we went there and dug deep in the archive. And I went there with another archaeologist and we explored into the ancient records. And what we found was an entire collection of the papers from that excavation that were never public, that had never gone public and no one had ever seen. And what we found were conflicting data points. One of them being even as simple as having different stratum layers be put in the wrong places and having arguments on where things lined up and where they belonged. And what we found is that there were, let me think of the right word to call this, there were disagreements amongst the American and German team that was in Shuruppak in 1931. And so when they wrote these papers, there was all kinds of conflictions. A lot of that is going to be in the documentary, but it was fascinating, Paul, to go into those records and actually see the whole story of what they were talking about and then be able to connect it. And I want to add one more thing. When I went to the museum and I started looking at the artifacts, I was stunned by what was there, Paul. We had original cuneiform tablets from many of the original Mesopotamian cities, like Nineveh and like Uruk and Ur and Eridu even. But one of them specifically got my attention. And I want to tell this story briefly before we sort of close out and give our thoughts on things coming up in the future. But there was an archaeologist there that was the head of the museum, and we got into I'll call it a conversation, a detailed conversation, because the tablet in front of me that I knew very well what it was called the Eridu Genesis. I've seen that image of that tablet 1,000 times. I've put it in all my books. I've put it in all my shows. I know what the Eridu Genesis tablet looks like. You can't, that is burned in my mind. And so when I was there it was the original Eridu Genesis tablet, one of the earliest tablets, potentially the earliest ever written. We don't know because it's part of this Eridu chapter of Adapa and the birthing of Eridu out of nothing, those are amongst the earliest stories ever written, and they've been carried down by the Babylonians and Assyrians. But what's fascinating is that this version of the Eridu Genesis was the original Sumerian version. It was the one that was the most important one, and there it was, sitting there in the cabinet with no label. It was not called Eridu Genesis, by the way.
Oh.
It was called the Sumerian flood story, Paul. Now, you know as well as I do, there are at least 4 different sets of tablets that have the Sumerian flood story. You have the Sumerian king list that mentions it. You have the Eridu Genesis. You have the Atrahasis. You have the Epic of Gilgamesh. You have the Legend of Itzubar, and there are more. So that's 5, and that's just some of them, okay? So to call it the Sumerian flood story is about as ambiguous as you can get. So when I brought that up, I was told that was not the official name, in which I said, I beg your pardon, but it is the official name. That's the catalog name that it's been given. And so this is what I want to impart here as a summary of my experience there. These excavations have had a lot of contradictions about these archaeologists and experts on how to decipher and understand what was found. And that is because of an old narrative versus an open-minded antiquarian thinking new narrative and understanding what might have been real and how an established narrative with so many archaeologists and other academics that are revered might be wrong, might need to be tweaked, actually does need to be tweaked, is very outdated, it's antiquated. And when I was in that conversation about the tablet, the same thing, and other tablets as well, the same thing came up, and in being very ambiguous, having the fact
Yes.
that possibly no one would even know what that is, or very few would ever know what's there. So how would the average person ever know what's in front of them? If they went into the museum and they wanted to learn about ancient history, ancient Mesopotamian history, it would just say the flood story and they would just casually walk by it like it's nothing. And so, Paul, really what we're doing here is that we're coming at this as scientific and academic as possible, working with geologists, archaeologists, working with ancient history experts, megalithic experts, and religious experts. We're going to come to this from every angle to look at this with fresh eyes, look at this with
Yes.
a scientific understanding, using the scientific method to analyze and objectively look at all of the data. Try to understand what maybe is missing, what has been missed, because clearly a lot of these things have been missed for various reasons. And so the exploration of
Yes.
Penn Museum went very well, Paul, but it's clear that these holes are wide and remaining
Yes.
open and need to be filled in. And that's really what we're a part of, isn't it, Paul?
It really is. And I found it very interesting looking at one of the papers that was produced by those archaeologists from the 1931 mission to Shrupak. With all the data that they had, and after all the reflection on that data in their paper, they make what they describe as a play in thought. That was the phrase they used, that they have to be very tentative
Very
and
careful in their
careful in
wording, weren't
saying
they?
this
Yeah, yeah.
because they know this is controversial, but they can't not mention that
Right.
this is very possibly a pre-Diluvian civilization we're talking about at that third
Yeah.
layer. And so, hats off to them for going there. They had to phrase it carefully, but they put it out there that that was the evidence of objective data they
Yeah.
had found excavating at that site. And then they very correctly related that to the narrative information from these ancient cultures, and said that at the time of the Sumerian civilization, these sites were referred to as belonging to antiquity. And so, when we talk about the Sumerians, we think, oh, yes, so 6,500 years ago, something like that, and forget that what they bequeathed us in their texts was references to something far older than themselves, to cities, places, cultures, civilizations that were in the deep, deep past, even in their day. And I love the fact that those correlations were made, that the stories that the Sumerians told were not in one basket as fable, and
Right.
then this play in thought is in another basket called fable. They actually brought them onto the same page and said we have to bring all this data together if we are to really understand what we're looking at and accept that we haven't, reached that encyclopedic understanding of these sites at this point. And I take my hats off to them for putting that out there. And again, we're going to sites that are ancient sites, and yet they too may be referring to things that were in their own deep past.
Right.
And so we're probing far further back into the human story than perhaps we've done before.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to be using both artifacts as well as the type of stone, because I want to bring up, and Paul mentioned a great point. Dating is available with the underwater ruins at Lake Vaughan, but what about other dating? Well, we have to really look at the basalt and andesite. As far as I've seen in anything that I've worked in, the Ararat civilization, as I'm calling it, the ones that have built the original basis of these temples, didn't use anything but basalt and andesite, as well as some of the other comparison sites in places like Peru, by the way, and Bolivia, which is very, very interesting that you find the same stone used. But that's a telltale sign right there. It's like a signature. Why is that
Yes.
important? Now, number one, it's important because it's a signature of what they created. But what's more important about it is that it shows, or at least strongly suggests, that number one, using the Mohs hardness scale of understanding where stones are and how hard they are to manipulate, something like an andesite is a 7 to a 7.5 out of 10. It's one of the hardest stones on earth. Basalt is very hard, just under andesite. And when we see the brick and mortar that the Urartian civilization was able to create, this very primitive brick and mortar and possibly some type of limestone sedimentary work and some minimal blocks, it's clear that they lacked the tools or the technological means to even manipulate at all these basalt and andesite blocks, really showing us that they're from another time period of history. And that's one of the ways that we can help catalog these, is understanding that, number one, a Bronze Age civilization could never manipulate or create in the most utter perfectedness that, like, especially something like Ayanis with these symbols, it's just remarkable. But not only that, but it shows us that these symbols have an origin point that then passed around and changed around the world, but from an origin point that seems very, very, you could call it very deep in antiquity, that goes, it predates all of them. And that's what's really the mystery we're exploring, Paul. The mystery of us, understanding what may be the very origins of the cross and divinity, understanding things like lowering the knowledge of how to reach the highest states of consciousness, becoming one with all of the universe and earth and nature, becoming one with the wonders of the chakras and unlocking these higher states within us. All these aspects of these teachings on how to be, how to become a master, seems to all come back to these areas. And that was what was being passed, it seems like, around the world, is number one, how to create these incredible temple spaces to connect that kind of energy and unlock that energy. But number two, the teachings involved in it and why it was important, what it could do. Imagine what is more important of anything you could imagine. Imagine resources, gold, silver, food, water, anything, the wheel, or all these things. Imagine what's more important than all of them. They're all building blocks. They're all things that lead to other things. But what would you want of anything if you had everything? If you're a civilization, which the greatest gift you could ever give is the knowledge of divinity, the knowledge of how to reach these divine states that turn you into this greater being that is one with all, that has been spoken about and sung by everything from Krishna to Buddha, all the way to the very beginning with Adapa, the great first sage of all time. This lost story of who we were and who we can become once again, Paul. It seems to all have its origins back to this mythical pre-Armenian ancient Lake Von region that something emerged from. And we're going to be going there and exploring it on a real-time basis. We're doing daily videos, as well as Paul and I doing interviews and talking about what we're seeing, and just seeing us actually go there and explore artifacts, explore these temples, ancient writings. This is the beginning of a much greater expedition that takes this and builds off of it. A lot of this, of what Paul and I are going to see, is part of the new book that I'm writing, The Missing Key of History, The Lost Ararat Civilization, which will be that exploring all these connections that start in Sumer and start in ancient Shuruppak and go all the way to Lake Von and then around the world, and connecting all of this. And that's what is going to be part of putting this together when we're there. Paul, I'm incredibly excited for all that's to come. This is going to be an adventure unlike what most people have seen. These are not tourist sites. This will truly be one of those ancient expedition journeys where we find things that we could probably never imagine. So I'm really excited to join this trip with you, Paul.
Oh, exactly the same. And I just reflect that whether we're listening to the Norse story of the Aesir, or the Hebrew stories of Abraham, or the ancient stories of Noah and Zisudra, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, these are stories about becoming more advanced, more intelligent, more conscious, better connected with the divine or with source. Those are elements of all those stories, and they're all pointing to the place where we're going.
Exactly. Well said, Paul. And I just want to close out with a couple things. Number one, there's going to be exclusive videos and pictures that don't make it on YouTube and social media that are going to be on my Patreon. So if you're interested in some of those deeper looks and some of those exclusive content, please check out my Patreon at Matthew LaCroix. As well as there will be daily videos on YouTube. Paul's going to have some pretty cool content. And if you're still interested in contributing for the documentary and this whole expedition, I was definitely we still need whatever we can get. We are putting together what is now a multi-trip, multifaceted kind of take on this to really tackle this with archaeologists, geologists, and megalithic and ancient experts to really get to the heart of these mysteries, Paul. And so I really appreciate overwhelmingly all the support that people have already given. A big part of this is thank you so much to everybody that's contributed so far to this and supported both Paul and I, as well as a great man named Martin Young, who's a big part of this as well. And so we're going to be meeting up and taking this great journey very soon, Paul. So please give a few closing statements before we get ready to pack and I guess get ready to leave, right?
I'm personally excited about the trip, but all the people who communicate with me on a day-to-day basis through the Paul Wallis channel and through the Paul Anthony Wallis website, they're excited too, Matt. We've got people all around the world who are wishing us every success in this project. And I'm very aware that we're making this trip on behalf of others. And we're doing this research on behalf of others, people who already feel like stakeholders in this project, because they would love to be there with us physically, but they're with us in spirit. And I feel the support of so many people in this project and pulling it together. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone who communicates with me on a daily basis. I do engage with that communication as much as is possible, and I'm really feeling the support that's going into this movie project.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo that one more time. Thank you so much for everyone that supports this. This would not be possible without all of you. And so this really is a journey about us all making these connections and discoveries together. All together, because I can't tell you how many incredible comments and people that have led me to things as part of these wonderful communities that overlap that Paul and I have with such gifted and incredible minds that are out there. We're all part of this. We're reconnecting and putting together the pieces of the lost human story to understand the lost connections we once had with this divine side of what we once were and what we can become once again. So Paul, I'm excited for this journey, my friend. Here we go. It's just begun.